I'll review a surprise announcement by El Salvador President Nayib Bukele, which could provide a model for leaders around the world. Nayib Bukele is the president of El Salvador, and this guy has sort of burst on the international scene, which is unusual. Normally, if you're running a small country like El Salvador, well, nobody pays any attention to you. Who's the president right now of Honduras? Well, you don't know, and I don't know either. Why? Because whoever that is, they're not making any waves. I happen to know the Sandinistas are still running Nicaragua, which is very unfortunate. And so things can't be going very well over there. You've still got kind of these old Marxists going back now to the 1980s and 90s. And they were ousted from power. They're back in power. But in El Salvador, you've got this remarkable fellow, Bukele, and he just won re-election by a huge margin. Why? Because he unleashed not just the police, but the military against the criminal gangs. MS-13, a number of other gangs, they were essentially running El Salvador, kind of the way the cartels run Mexico. And this guy goes, well, you're very powerful. You've got a lot of money. You're collecting a lot of revenues from drugs and other things. But guess what? I have the El Salvador military, and we've got better weapons. And so he unleashed the military on these guys and launched a campaign of, I mean, perhaps extermination is not too strong a word, but he crushed the gangs in El Salvador, and to the point where they were whining about not getting, proper burials. We can't be buried with our gang colors. And as if Bukele could be moved by something so idiotic. And then that was kind of his one issue for a while. That was the main thing he was doing. But then he decided to start doing some other interesting things. He essentially said, all right, well, we actually don't have that many people in El Salvador. We can use some more, but we don't want riffraff. We don't want the kind of people coming across the U.S. southern border. No. We want talented people. We want smart people. We want entrepreneurs. We want people with good ideas. We want people with degrees. We want people to come invest in El Salvador. I'm going to make it easy for those people to come legally. So think about it. Think about how this guy in a small country pays far more attention to the welfare of his country and his border than we do in this country. And now his latest move, which was he calls together his top officials, cabinet. There seem to be like 40 people in the room. And he goes, guys, I'm really glad you're all here. Guess why you're here? It's because right here next to me is my attorney general, and I'm going to have all of us, every single one of us in this room, investigated for corruption. Why? He goes, because corruption is a very widespread in our part of the world. And quite frankly, he could have said all over the world. I mean, I can tell you, for example, and this I'm getting mainly from my family members in India, corruption is rife. If somebody is a chief minister of a part of India and you want to build a new building, 10% of the revenues from that building are going to end up in this guy's pocket. And so you've got Indian politicians who are worth millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, all by kickbacks that they have institutionalized into the system. Any transaction that occurs that's profitable, they get a cut. And this happens all over the world. So Bukele says, listen, when we look back at the presidents of El Salvador, so many of them are corrupt. There are some who are not corrupt. President Duarte, he mentions Duarte, is well known for having been very straight-laced. But he goes, but guess what? He might have been straight-laced, but all the people around him were corrupt. And so corruption was still the defining feature of El Salvador. And then he goes, look, you only live once. I've decided that not only am I not going to be corrupt, I'm not going to be surrounded by corrupt people. And so I want to make sure that none of you are taking bribes, none of you are on the take, none of you are using extortion, and if you are, you'll end up in the place that you deserve to be, namely jail. Now, when I first saw this, I was like, wow, this is pretty impressive. Is he actually going to do it? 2 days later, I read, Christian Herson Flores, using his position as presidential commissioner, was demanding money from people and companies in exchange for benefits and preferential participation in government projects. He's been arrested. So Bukele, again, is setting a standard, an example to people, leaders around the world. He's basically saying, I am an open book with regard to corruption. I'm going to ask myself to be investigated. and I'm going to make sure that all the people around me who are coming to government not to do good, but to do well for themselves, to enrich themselves, are going to be scrutinized and are going to be punished. I think, can you imagine if you had this kind of ruthless enforcement of anti-crime policies, border policies? I mean, if you applied this Bukele standard in America, I predict that 90% of Democrats and about 40% of Republicans would be arrested tomorrow. Why? Because they're getting kickbacks in one way or the other. They're benefiting from being at the swamp. They're ultimately there for their own benefit, not the benefit of the country. So even though all their language, if you listen to them, well, we're public servants, well, we're attempting to do good for people. It's not that they're not motivated by any good intentions. It's that they pay careful attention to their own bottom line. And that's Bukele's point. You get a salary for working in the government. You don't want it, don't work in the government. But if you do take the job, you can't take kickbacks on the side. And if you do, you're going to be investigated. You're going to be prosecuted. So every time I see that this guy's done something new, I'm like, what is it this time? And I'm like, I feel like breaking into applause.